It's the holiday season of 1992, and you know what that means. Like clockwork, Wily Claus has paid us another visit to deliver us a Mega Man sequel yet again. And that's really less of a joke than you might think. Despite being an artist first and foremost, Keiji Inafune was basically in charge of the Mega Man series at this point. With another new supervisor above him and a team of new and old below him, he had become the cornerstone for Mega Man design philosophy. And with the team already having done everything they wanted to do with Mega Man 4, somehow, the next entry turned into Mega Man 4 but powered up. And indeed, that came to pass, whether that be a good or bad thing. At this point, these games are actually getting really hard for me to tell apart. That's not to say any of the second NES trilogy are mechanically bad games per se, but not much changes between them compared to how distinct the games of the first NES trilogy felt. But if you were ever motivated to do a Buster-only run in one of these games, Mega Man 5 is probably the optimal game to do it. Charge speed is increased from Mega Man 4, and the charge shot size is also doubled, which is honestly ridiculous given how good the charge shot was to begin with. Other than that, the other major gameplay addition to this game was Beat, a small robotic bird built by Dr. Cossack. Yeah, let's see how long he stays a relevant character. Beat is cool though, another robotic helper you unlock after collecting all 8 plates hidden in the Robot Master levels. He basically acts as a homing missile that repeatedly targets any vulnerable enemies nearby at the cost of ammo, which frees the player up to focus on platforming and dodging attacks and such. And considering he's useful against all 4 Dark Men and the Wily capsule, it's worth recruiting him. Another addition includes the introduction of M-Tanks, which fully replenish your energy and ammo, but can only be carried one at a time. Oh, and they also tweaked the rush coil to be objectively worse this time, hooray! The Robot Master weapons this time are mostly fine. Nothing stands out as particularly bad or good, with maybe 2 exceptions. Like, you would think a weapon named Gravity Hold would be pretty good, right? Not really, unfortunately. Any space or time-based weapons end up being highly situational with few exceptions. You'll use it against Gyro Man, and that's probably it. I found it useful in moments where I was overwhelmed by groups of small enemies, who are most vulnerable to it, but it's still very much a situational weapon. Charge Kick is cool in that it isn't really a standalone weapon so much as an enhancement to Mega Man's slide move. It still uses weapon ammo, and so it shouldn't be busted out willy-nilly, but it protects Mega Man from certain enemies and hazards, with usually the only exceptions being the larger enemies. But then there's the Power Stone. This weapon is absolute junk. I'm frankly astounded that there are people who still say the Top Spin is the worst Robot Master weapon when the Power Stone exists. I found exactly 1 instance in the game where it actually managed to be effective. Even against the Robot Master who's supposed to be weak to it, this weapon is damn near useless. You're honestly better off just using the charge shot against Charge Man. Which, now that I say it out loud, does make a lot of sense. Honestly, picking up a literal stone and throwing it would be a more effective weapon, but that would basically just be the super arm from the first game. And to top it all off, Stone Man's stage itself is also overly long and uneventful, so fuck this guy. Also, just look at Charge Man. He's a little train, that's cute. Also somewhat notably, Starman's stage has effectively replaced the usual underwater level by using similar jump physics, which I thought was a nice change of pace, if only conceptually. Gravity Man had an interesting stage gimmick as well, with these arrows that changed the direction of gravitational pull. Oh, and my co-writer absolutely insists I point out that the napalm bomb in this game looks and behaves nothing like real napalm, but if you ask me, that isn't where his suspension of disbelief should be challenged in this franchise. To which he retorts, and I quote, "Let me use my chemistry degree as I damn well please." So, let's be honest, Mega Man 5 is just kinda here. It doesn't add anything to the greater narrative, it doesn't innovate Mega Man's gameplay in any meaningful way, and it really doesn't leave much of an impression at all. It gave us Beat, but that's about as minimum an addition that could actually be counted as an addition. No offense to Beat, he's perfectly fine. But looking back at what came before, nothing has changed. And look, I gotta be real with you guys here, I barely even finished this one. I've beaten Mega Man 5 before, years ago, but at a certain point during this particular playthrough, I just got fed up. Keep in mind, I'm not using an emulator for these games. I'm playing on actual hardware. I don't have access to save states or hacks or whatever. Game overs mean redoing an entire level, and frankly, I'm just not all that invested in the classic Mega Man series post Mega Man 3 to feel so determined to see the end of each one. After my probably 9th or so game over on Wily Stage 1, I called it a night, and only after sleeping on it for a day did I decide to actually commit to beating the game. We're 5 entries in. I'm tired of the cookie-cutter Mega Man game design. Tired of running out of ammo against Robot Masters and leaving my only option as to get a game over. Tired of doing 8 stages in a row at the end of the game because you can't save in the middle of the Wily levels and whatever the fuck comes before those. I'm tired of having to beat each Robot Master twice per game. I'm tired of Wily's machine being a humongous pain in the ass that's only weak to one weapon that usually isn't very good or easy to use. Which, to be fair, was not the case with this one, but still. There's also this Battletoads Turbo Tunnel bullshit that they pull in Waveman stage that had me pulling my hair out. It's all grown stale, and I'm frankly just not a big enough fan of this franchise for the formula to still land with me once I'm 5 games deep. By Mega Man 5, this series desperately needed some fresh air, and for the sake of my sanity, I need to be able to call it quits when it becomes too much. I'll at least finish covering the second trilogy, but after that I'll probably only be covering the Mega Man X games. So, see you guys in a few months for Mega Man 6, I guess. Over the years, the idea of replay value in video games has become something of a lost art. Games nowadays are less concerned with incentivizing repeat plays than they are with making the initial play as jam-packed with content as possible. Video games, on average, have been getting longer and longer for decades at this point. Fighting games, horror games, and platformers are still keeping short play times and replay value alive as best they can, but the biggest mainstream AAA titles tend to be made to last first and foremost. So for a genre that has always had a reputation for long single playthroughs, RPGs have never really concerned themselves with building in an intrinsic replay value. When getting to the end credits can take dozens of hours, most people won't feel much motivation to devote that sort of time again, if not much is going to change the second time. I can think of few examples to challenge this norm better than Final Fantasy V, possibly the most replayable classic RPG this side of Chrono Trigger. Released at the tail end of 1992, Final Fantasy V builds on the solid groundwork established by FF4. In terms of presentation, environments are a lot more complex and visually rich, with far fewer instances of the black void screen edges seen in previous games. They really tried to make each location feel like a fully fleshed out space, rather than a bunch of sprites mapped onto a black screen like in prior entries. The game's interface also saw a few tweaks from last time. A handy new Optimize option automatically equips gear with the highest available stats. The player's item inventory can now auto-sort by category, although any organizing beyond that still needs to be done by hand. But more importantly, item capacity is now, for the first time, unrestricted. You can hold every item in the game no problem. But if you're a fan of Fat Chocobo and are worried he was put out of a job, fret not, he remains as an Easter egg for the Chocobo summon spell. The ATB system returns, now with a visible gauge tracking each party member's wait time toward their next turn. This visualization allows the player to actively see which character is set to act next, and plan their next few turns accordingly. The game even includes a form of multiplayer, where a second controller can be used to control 2 of your party members during battle. This is a feature that wouldn't last past the Super Famicom era because literally nobody ever used it. The infamous Tonberry enemy also made its first appearance in this entry. Did I need to mention that? No, but I think Tonberries are cool, so I wanted to say something. One of the primary goals of FF5, according to Hironobu Sakaguchi, was to grant the player more direct control over their characters than ever before. And Final Fantasy V would do this by creating the most in-depth gameplay the series had yet seen, and possibly has ever seen. While the party size has been reduced from 5 back to the standard 4, that's perfectly fine in light of FF5 bringing back the job system. Hiroyuki Ito would prove himself to be a valuable team member among the FF staff, as after inventing the ATB system for FF4, which would define the franchise's battles for almost a decade, Ito, along with Akihiko Matsui, would repurpose the Final Fantasy III system into a newer, bigger, and better form. Characters can once again choose between a large selection of different specialties, and this time without all the fussing about with capacity points. Jobs can be swapped around at absolutely no penalty. Including the default freelancer job, FF5 sees a total of 22 different jobs. One fewer than FF3, sure, but 5 more than makes up for this, not only by replacing the more redundant jobs with completely unique ones, but also by being far more versatile and freeing than the initial iteration of the system. In addition to the jobs themselves having unique traits, the game also tracks each job's individual level, which increases via ability points awarded at the end of battle. Whereas FF3's capacity points simply affected how powerful a character was in a certain job, when a job levels up in FF5, that character gains an ability that can then be set to any other job they use. These abilities can range from action abilities, such as stealing or the various schools of magic, to the ability to equip weapons and armor that a job perhaps wouldn't normally be able to use, or even just straight stat buffs. You can also choose to pass on innate passive abilities as well, such as a ninja's ability to dual wield or the thief's ability to run on the overworld map or see hidden passages. You can only set one additional ability to each job, but this capacity for mixing and matching makes for a game with endless amounts of customization, experimentation, and replayability. And just as the cherry on top, every character has separate unique sprites for each of the 22 jobs, which is just an incredible amount of graphical variety for a game of this era. Almost every job from FF3 returned in some form or another. I mean, I doubt anybody will really miss the Viking or Scholar, right? But this new version of the system ensures that none of those become outdated throughout the course of the game. Every job has unique abilities that can be used by other jobs. And mastering a job also means that the initial freelancer class gains all the innate passive abilities and stat boosts of the mastered job. In other words, the freelancer becomes more powerful with the more jobs you've maxed out. And in addition, the freelancer can equip 2 job abilities instead of just 1, as well as use any piece of equipment. But even so, mastering jobs isn't required to become a powerhouse. Final Fantasy V, perhaps more than any other turn-based RPG I've played, perfectly embodies the school of play smarter, not harder. The entire game, each random encounter, every boss fight is like a playground to mess around with all the tools at your disposal, and you can get incredibly clever with it. The new Blue Mage and its corresponding school of magic revolves around learning enemy abilities for the party's own use, such as 1000 Needles and the ever-useful Mighty Guard and White Wind. The Chemist on paper may sound lame, but its ability to combine items to perform various effects can really come through in a pinch. The new Beastmaster job specializes in interacting with enemies, being able to catch weakened ones Pokemon style to then sick them on another enemy later on. Or once it's gained a few levels, it can control enemies directly, which can be useful in learning some of those tricky blue magic spells. The new Time Mage can cast the horrendously broken Return spell, which restarts the current battle from the beginning, including re-rolling for things like preemptive strikes. And this can be used to retry a battle that isn't going well, or can help when you're trying to steal specific rare items. The secret Mime job can equip a whopping 3 abilities from other jobs, as well as repeat the last action taken by a party member, whatever that may be, without using any MP. Even bards weren't neglected here. While the job itself suffers from low base stats and poor equipment selection, leveling it up enough to equip the Sing ability on another job is definitely worth your time, as the different songs can inflict party-wide effects at no MP cost, and very few enemies are immune to songs. Everything combines into an RPG experience where your job level and equipment become far more important than your character's traditional EXP, and where abilities and special properties are often paramount over raw stats. Why equip an accessory that raises your stats when you could equip a Protect Ring, which grants inherent regen and protection against instant death? Or the Hermes Sandals that gives the character permanent haste status, essentially doubling the amount of turns they get. You could equip the armor that raises your defense, or just equip a Mirage Vest instead, guaranteeing that the first physical attack performed on you will miss, giving you just enough time to kill the enemies before they get a second turn. Why equip the Genji shield with its high defense stat, when the Aegis shield will just flat out block 1/3 of the magical attacks thrown your way? FF5 is a game where brute forcing your way through is the poor man's solution. The real fun comes in seeing just how ridiculously you can break the game in half.
And this ironically makes that fancy new optimize feature pretty pointless later on, as it will always prioritize stats over secondary effects, thus forcing you to manually equip anyway. But if you want to brute force your way through the game, nobody's stopping you. The dual wield and two-handed abilities both essentially double your damage output. Rapid fire allows you to attack 4 times per turn with perfect accuracy. Combine that with dual wield and voila, you're now hitting with 8 unblockable attacks per turn. Combine that even further with the Mystic Knight's Spellblade ability, and you can also hit an enemy's elemental weakness with every hit. This game's possibilities are incredible. And Square knew they had a good thing on their hands, because Final Fantasy V was the entry that officially introduced the concept of optional superbosses to the franchise. While FF1 had war mechs, FF2 had iron giants, and FF3 had its colored dragons, those were all just incredibly rare random encounters that mainly served to blindside the player should they ever come across them. FF5, though, has 2 enemies you can engage with in its final dungeon that are there specifically to challenge the player. Both Shinryu and Omega, I know a war mech when I see one, Square, are much tougher than the game's final boss, and defeating both are legitimate challenges that test the player's knowledge of the battle and job systems to its fullest. Remember what I said earlier about your job levels and equipment being way more important than EXP? These superbosses are perhaps the best representation of that. Most other RPGs that have optional endgame challenges would require you to be around level 70 minimum to even stand a chance. But here, you can pull it off in the late 40s to early 50s. Hell, I pulled it off at level 40, just by using the right equipment setup and strategy. It's really brilliant stuff. Defeating these guys gets you nothing but medals proving you've done so, being quite a literal license to brag, and it's not just the super bosses. The entire game is noticeably more difficult than a lot of the other entries of the franchise. And this is really out of necessity, given the number of options the player has at any given moment. They had to pump up the difficulty, just to encourage you not to over-rely on the same handful of jobs and abilities for the whole game. And the game even subtly nudges you into avoiding the usual OCD-esque tendencies RPG players tend to commit to. Keeping all your party members at the same level is actually a bad idea in a game where certain enemies have level-specific attacks. For instance, level 5 Death instantly kills any character with a level divisible by 5, and there's no way to block this. If you are of an applicable level, you die, period. But you still want at least one character to be hit by it, as it's a blue spell that the player will then be able to use themselves. And that thing I mentioned before about not brute forcing your way through the game, that even applies to how you build your characters. Leveling up every job on every character is an unnecessary and time-consuming process, as is just buying 4 of every piece of equipment to cover all your bases. That's going to be unbelievably expensive, borderline unviable. You're much better off specializing and spreading out your party's preferred jobs. During the game's 3rd act, you're required to split your party to climb Fork Tower, each side of which forbids either physical or magical attacks, really driving home the idea that you should have characters that are specialized adequately in one or the other. The game's replay potential is demonstrated perhaps nowhere better than the annual fan charity event, the Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta, wherein donors are given a set of 4 randomly selected jobs and tasked with attempting to beat the entire game with only those jobs. If they wish to change their current setup, they can donate more money to be randomly given 4 different jobs instead. And indeed, every sort of single job challenge for this game has been able to finish the game. The fact that any team can beat the game given enough resources and the right strategy proves just how immaculately designed and balanced this game was. I could go on for days. Final Fantasy V is one of the most versatile, liberating, and straight-up fun RPGs out there, and it's all thanks to the incredible depth of its job system. While future games like Final Fantasy Tactics and 10-2 would further improve and innovate on this system, I still believe FF5's rendition is the quintessential one. In my FF4 review, I voiced some qualms about how restrictive the progression and character building in that game could feel, and FF5 overcorrects this in the best way. But while the gameplay of FF5 is pretty universally praised, its story is a fair bit more contentious. Not that the story is bad, it's just noticeably more light than the entry immediately preceding it. The characters are for sure pretty paper thin, there's no arguing that, which is definitely disappointing after FF4's excellent cast. But the story of FF5 really isn't as bad as some detractors would lead you to believe. Penned by Sakaguchi alongside newcomer and future FF7 co-writer Yoshinori Kitase, it's a swashbuckling adventure story that harkens back to classic 80s shonen anime, which is honestly a pretty nice change of pace after FF4's non-stop and often relentless dramatics. In fact, FF5's plot conceptually is almost a remake of FF3's plot. It involves a ragtag group of unlikely teammates being bestowed the powers of the elemental crystals, which are shattering for reasons unknown, and by doing so, they threaten to destroy the balance of the world. Our group of heroes become the successors of the Warriors of Dawn, who saved the world from a similar fate 30 years prior, and the new team is tasked with solving whatever is causing the crystal's destruction. Just like in FF3, the group are granted new jobs upon locating each crystal, and even the villain, Exdeath, has a similar motivation to FF3's Cloud of Darkness, being an eldritch hive mind who seeks nothing more than to drown all of existence in the nothingness that is the Void. FF5 even repeats a side quest from 3, where you circle the world on a chocobo to earn a reward, which is just so oddly specific that I had to point it out. And the game sets its tone right away. If you're playing on a fresh cart with no save files, opening credits will play as soon as you hit the new game button, with the excellent main theme accompanying main character Bartz as he rides his chocobo through the lands. It's a simple sequence that sets the mood of a mystical and action-packed journey, and it does so very well because FF5's main theme is probably the most unapologetically adventurous of the series. As the game begins proper, you're greeted with a long sequence of cutscenes and scripted events, accompanied by probably the most ambitious score the series has yet seen. It's written like a movie score. In fact, the entire soundtrack of FF5 is full of this sense of grand scale and larger-than-life wonder, right down to the battle theme, which evokes not so much a feeling of tension or danger, but rather excitement. Harvest Hoedown is over the top and ridiculous in the best way. And Cursed Lands might be one of my all-time favorites. The drums during the final battle with Exdeath always get my heart pumping. And I can't be the only one who always laughs at Mambo de Chocobo and its stupid cheesy grunt. And of course, I have to bring up Gilgamesh and his associated theme, Battle on the Big Bridge. First of all, the song is the best work Uematsu has ever done, and no, that is not open for debate, thank you. Gilgamesh himself would become a series staple. Not only did he start the trend of Final Fantasy games having goofy recurring sidekick villains for the sake of comic relief, but Gilgamesh would continue to appear in future games as a secret summon or boss fight. And unlike with the Sids or the various recurring summon beasts throughout each FF entry, Gilgamesh is the exact same character each time, hopping dimensions through the Final Fantasy multiverse, so to speak.
I've been waiting in this Coliseum for so very long now. I was starting to worry that you'd never download this part of the game, and I'd be stuck in digital limbo.
But the game's story isn't all goofs and gaffs and hilarious hijinks. Conceptually, the game's story can get pretty dark when you really stop to think about it, even if the characters' flat personalities mean they don't always react with the appropriate sense of weight. Exdeath as a villain is actually pretty horrifying, a living embodiment of evil inhabiting a giant empty husk of metal armor, driven by nothing but the collective hatred of thousands of evil souls after a millennium of being trapped away in a mystic prison, and now bent on condemning all of existence to the same fate in petty revenge. His backstory is ambiguous and mysterious. Exdeath is not a layered or sympathetic adversary. He is pure evil, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with, which once again harkens back to the 80s adventure anime that influenced FF5's story, which often featured similar villains who were just evil for the sake of evil. And overall, the story displays a healthy amount of self-awareness throughout. If you were to describe Final Fantasy IV as a stage play starring the jobs from FF3, then Final Fantasy V, in turn, could be called a lampoon of FF4's ridiculous melodrama. All of the prior game's twists are cheekily skewered, right down to the main character secretly being the son of an otherworldly hero. Taking it even further, the game's entire first act almost seems written to be a deconstruction of the classic Final Fantasy formula. The crystals are under threat, like usual, but this time, the heroes don't save the day. The crystals still shatter, leaving the world in turmoil, and the party has to find another way to make things right again. It's almost like Square themselves was finally retiring the classic crystals plot in the most literal and direct way they could. I've noticed that most people who complain about FF5's plot tend not to make it far enough into the game to get past that initial crystals storyline, because once the game breaks away from that formula and forms its own story, it does become a fairly gripping tale that I feel gets far too much flack from those who never gave it a fair shake. The most famous plot point from FF5, though, is no doubt that it features the first instance of a long-term party member dying in the line of duty. Final Fantasy II and IV had minor and temporary characters sacrifice themselves or whatever, but Final Fantasy V was different. Its party was structured like FF1 or 3, where you have the same party of 4 characters for the entire game. There was no revolving door. As far as you knew, you were sticking it out with these characters through thick and thin. But near the end of the game's second act, your party is ambushed by Exdeath in the Great Forest of Moor, and the villain seizes this world's crystals and has the party on the ropes, sitting ducks to be plucked away at his leisure. But then, seeing his teammates, as well as his granddaughter, so close to death, Galuf manages to stand. In a blaze of glory, fighting even past the point of 0 HP, he fends off Exdeath, giving his life in the process. And the game doesn't pull any punches. Despite the remaining party members' attempts to revive him, they are unsuccessful. The game spells it out to the audience clear as day. Galuf has died. Now, mechanically, this doesn't change anything much at all, as all of Galuf's acquired abilities, stats, and equipment are passed on to his granddaughter via what might be the most heartfelt scene of the game, but the impact of the moment isn't lessened by this. The characters, and by extension the player as well, have their resolve strengthened and find further reason to bring an end to Exdeath. This definitely isn't the most famous party member death in Final Fantasy history, as I'm sure you know, but it was the first of its kind. But that's far from FF5's only crowning plot point, if you ask me. The game's third act, taking place on the merged world, was a legitimately good plot twist that I don't think gets enough credit. You've just defeated Exdeath in what seems like the climactic confrontation of the game, scaling his castle of body horror and avenging the death of your fallen teammate. And even though you saw the world's crystals shatter after Exdeath fell, your party finds themselves back in their home world. This is it, right? You've won. But, amongst all the celebration, your team can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. And as you leave to investigate, you notice the landscape you had gotten used to during your initial trip through the first world has changed, quite drastically. And then, several areas of said world are suddenly sucked into the void, as Exdeath returns stronger than ever. You didn't win. Not at all. You played right into the villain's hands, reforming the two worlds into one as they originally were 1,000 years prior, setting the final phase of Exdeath's plan in motion. Final Fantasy III and IV similarly had multiple world maps, but none were delivered with the gravitas of FF5's merged world. And the game culminates in what is easily the largest and most ambitious final dungeon yet, wherein your party dives into the void itself and travels through the lost and shattered remnants of all the worlds it's consumed to confront Exdeath and finally restore normalcy. I've always said that the true indicator of a great RPG story is not when the ending makes you cry, but when it makes you smile. Not laugh, just smile. And Final Fantasy V does that. Seeing the characters finally succeed after so many failures, finally earn a chance to rest, and meet up again a year later to reminisce on their journey and pay respects to Galuf one more time, it just makes me feel all fuzzy, goddammit! And speaking of the ending, FF5 is the first in the series to have multiple endings, depending on which characters are still standing when you defeat Exdeath once and for all. So, I mean, that's cool. I can't think of many other Final Fantasy games that have multiple endings. All this to say, Final Fantasy V's story is good, actually. All that being said, I certainly don't love every little bit of this game. Playing through, I did find myself feeling a bit underleveled by the end of the first act, even though I'd been diligent about side quests and leveling my jobs. The barrier tower sucks because it's long and boring and every enemy is a pain in the ass, and the boss at the end of it is one of the most notoriously difficult. While we're at it, the Phoenix Tower kinda sucks too, but at least that one's optional. But the one annoyance that really permeates through the entire game is that it is an absolute nightmare for a completionist like me. The game keeps track of how many treasure chests you've obtained via this little NPC fortune teller here. This gives you a percentage right there and then, just asking you to obsess over it. But Final Fantasy V is full of chests, spells, and the like that can be overlooked and missed forever, as well as several areas that are either one-time visits or limited access, including 2 full-on points of no return that see specific old areas disappearing forever. And that fortune teller dude doesn't even show up until the game is basically over, so you can't even check your progress as you go. Someone aiming for a 100% run in this game is basically required to play with a checklist and keep multiple save files in case they screw anything up. While I absolutely adore this game when it comes to player choice and agency, it's a giant headache when it comes to being even a little bit thorough. So, after the intense amount of praise I've given this game, it may be a bummer for some of you to learn that Final Fantasy V was not initially released outside of Japan. While it didn't spend nearly as long in localization limbo as Final Fantasy III or even II, FF5 would be stuck in Japan for several years. Not for lack of trying, though. Final Fantasy V was indeed planned to be America's Final Fantasy III, and Ted Woolsey even had an English script almost entirely translated. However, the English localizers decided that the game was too complex and difficult for the average American, who, if the existence of Mystic Quest is any indication, Square was fully convinced were a bunch of stupid, drooling babies who could only engage with the most brain-dead of entertainment. Mystic Quest was created specifically to fill the gap left by FF5 with something more accessible in order to train American players on RPGs. Which is a bunch of baloney if you ask me, but I already did a whole video about it, so I'm not going to repeat myself. After this, at least 2 more attempts would be made at localizing Final Fantasy V, the first of which planned to drop the Roman numeral and market the game as a sort of spin-off title, but this was quickly abandoned. A second attempt would begin in 1997, after the massive success of Final Fantasy VII finally brought widespread mainstream interest to the brand. Developer Top Dog Software was commissioned to release a Windows port of the game under the title Final Fantasy Extreme, in reference to the game's heightened difficulty. But apparently communication issues between the Western studio and Square over in Japan resulted in that project being dropped as well. And after repeatedly having their hopes dashed over the years, fans grew frustrated and took matters into their own hands. A fan translation of Final Fantasy V would see release online in 1998, and was one of the earliest widespread examples of a video game fan translation. Even once the game finally did see an official English release on the PlayStation in 1999, the fan translation would remain the favored version among many. This was no doubt thanks to the PS1 port being pretty shoddy, and the localized script, based on the work done for the earlier cancelled PC version, was really bad, actually. And having played said fan translation for this video, I can say that while it's definitely not perfect and definitely shows its age, it is a remarkable piece of work for its time. If you told me this was a scrapped Woolsey script, I'd probably believe you. It does come off as a bit stilted and wooden at times, and there are a few formatting gaffes here and there, but I can definitely say I'd still recommend this over the PS1 version. I mean, if the officially licensed translation can have its "why burn," then the fan translation can have its "anda grande." And it's really because of FF5's late English release that the game has never really found massive popularity over here, which is a pretty stark contrast to its reputation in Japan. In a recent interview with the staff of Final Fantasy XVI, all but one of those present placed FF5 within their top 3 favorites of the series, and several of them had it as their number 1 pick. FF5 in Japan outsold all of the previous entries by a wide margin, and only barely trailed behind FF6 once it came out a few years later. The game even got a sequel anime in 1994, taking place hundreds of years after the events of the game, and this anime was localized into English before the actual game was. And evidently the dubbing studio had just finished a recording session of Tenchi Muyo and were like, hey, while we've got you here. But by the time Final Fantasy V did come out in America, we had already gotten Final Fantasy VII and VIII. And those games were lofty, ambitious, cinematic masterworks that were breaking new ground and pushing the boundaries of storytelling in video games. And in light of those, it didn't matter how good FF5's gameplay was. The average American simply wasn't interested in a 7-year-old 16-bit RPG full of bright colors and silly characters. And those who did play the game likely failed to understand the appeal or context of the original release. You mean there aren't any unskippable CG cutscenes? No minute-and-a-half-long summon animations? No depressed edgy boy protagonist? This isn't my Final Fantasy! Someone tell the guys at Square that RPGs aren't about building a team and going on an adventure. They're about watching some other guy build a team and go on an adventure while he whines the whole time. I mostly kid, but no, at the time, people just weren't interested in gameplay-driven RPGs. The majority of American Final Fantasy fans entered the franchise with FF7, which was this grand story-driven epic that spanned multiple CD-ROMs and potentially 100 hours of content. And I feel like if FF5 had been released in 1992 or 93 like it should have been, Americans would appreciate it a lot more. Don't get me wrong, those who have played the game typically have a lot of nice things to say about it. The problem is that it's hard just to convince people to even play the pre-7 FF games at all. And for some reason it feels like 5 ends up being overlooked more than a lot of the others, even being as readily available as it is these days. It also doesn't help that the game never got what I would consider an ideal English script. The fan translation is serviceable, albeit stiff and unprofessional, and the PS1 script is embarrassingly awful. It's like they took the first draft and just said, great, no notes. And while the GBA translation that's been carried over into every release since is the most complete and professional quality translation we've gotten, its tone is the opposite extreme of the previous two. It's overwritten. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for having a bit of fun and taking some liberties with the source material, as long as those liberties remain true to the intended spirit. But the current English script for Final Fantasy V contains jokes and quips during tense or dramatic moments, and these largely weren't present in the Japanese. I can understand the desire to inject some personality into a story that's commonly been criticized for being a bit flat, but did we really need the entire game to be written like an episode of Futurama? Like, yeah, give Gilgamesh some corny one-liners and pop culture references. I get it, his whole thing is being the comic relief. But why is every other character also trying to be the comic relief? I get what they were going for, but it makes it almost impossible to take even the game's heaviest moments seriously, and only furthers the less than stellar reputation this game's story has struggled to shake for years. It's bad enough we have to stop our own fanbase from calling the main character Butts. Can we not make it worse than it already is? That's not a joke, by the way. The main character's Japanese name is Butts. It's spelled with a Z, but yeah, it's Butts. The English version changed this to Barts, and there are fans who get unironically upset about this for some reason. Like, look, I'm usually all for maintaining the integrity of the source material, but maybe the Japanese staff should have done the bare minimum of due diligence to make sure the fantastical, foreign-sounding name they picked for their central character wasn't accidentally also the pinnacle of every American 8-year-old's sense of humor. Yeah, if you haven't been able to glean just from the sheer length of this review, Final Fantasy V is my favorite of the 2D Final Fantasies, and very well may just be my favorite Final Fantasy, full stop. It has near endless replay value, and also kind of represents something of an end to the classic era of the franchise. After this entry, Sakaguchi would step down from series director to a producing role, letting the newer guard step up and take the reins of the series moving forward. And it's at this point that the franchise would see a noticeable shift in style and tone. While the FF6 stands would deign to acknowledge this, Final Fantasy VI sure has a whole lot more in common with FF7 than it does with FF5. But Final Fantasy V represents the quintessence of everything that made classic Final Fantasy classic Final Fantasy. If someone were to ask me, what was this franchise like before 7, FF5 would no doubt be the first and only game I point to. Everything you expect to see in a 2D Final Fantasy is represented at its best here, and it's no wonder that prior to Final Fantasy IX, 5 is the entry Sakaguchi would name as his favorite. Everything he had hoped to accomplish with the original Final Fantasy was finally achieved in this one, and I absolutely love it to death. Final Fantasy V represents the heart and soul of the franchise's classic era. It is the definitive Final Fantasy.